Hello, dear students and esteemed learners. Welcome back. Now, this is lecture number 19, and today we will cover a very interesting topic, which is Michel Foucault and medicalization. That means we will try to understand Foucault's contribution to the understanding of the process of medicalization. And in this lecture, I have tried to cover many concepts which somehow talk about the processes related to medicalization from Foucauldian perspective, like medical discourses, then medicine of the species and medicine of social spaces, medical gaze, then three phases of biopolitics, and then a criticism of that. Now, you may remember we talked about Foucault and Foucauldian perspective when we were talking about the theoretical perspectives in sociology of health. So that time we talked about several perspectives. We started with the biomedical perspective, and then we talked about the functionalist perspective, Marxist perspective, and then we also talked about the symbolic interactionist and post-structural perspective. And within the post-structural perspective, we talked about the contribution made by Michel Foucault. So from that connection, you will understand that Foucault is primarily considered as a post-structural thinker. He is a social thinker, and he has authored many books, and he is considered one of the very important theorist, contributor, philosopher who has helped to understand the dynamics of power and knowledge which are operating in the contemporary societies. They are basically operating in a very specific way, and Foucault has tried to make us understand those things. So we will talk about some of these things in this lecture. Let's go to the first slide. Now, the first term that I have included here is an effort to understand medical discourses. Now, discourses is a very important concept in Foucauldian perspective, and Foucault has used the word discourse in multiple ways, multiple sense. Sometimes students find it difficult to understand, but I have tried to keep these concepts very simple to the best of my understanding and capacity, so that they should not miss the original meaning. But I hope that you will understand these concepts. So Foucault basically authored many books. Some of these are Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, The History of Sexuality. Right. So in these books, Foucault has tried to express his ideas and emphasize the increasing penetration of medical ideas and practices in a Western way of thinking, particularly from the period of the Enlightenment onwards. So there are two or three important things. First, that Foucault talks about his medical ideas and practices which are related to the Western ways of thinking, and in a specific period of time, particularly from the period of the Enlightenment onwards. We will try to understand these things. Foucault did not typically use the term medicalization, but tended to present a consonant vision that shows the impact of medical discourses on people's life. So as we talked about medicalization, different definitions of medicalization, then Ivan Illich's concept of medicalization, that way Foucault has not talked about medicalization. But because he talked about multiple concepts which are related to this process, so we can try to understand how these concepts are trying to understand this process, or how these are related to this process. Foucault's concept of power differed from that of writers such as Zola or Illich. Now, when we talk about basically the way medical system is operating in the contemporary Western society, then very often there is a reference of the word power of the medical professionals. Now, we talked about the contribution made by Irving Zola and Ivan Illich. They have been talking about the concept of power of the medical professionals, but their approach was little different. Now, why we are saying now? Because we should have an understanding that Foucault's approach to handle these situations is different, and his concept of power is also different. So, what is medical discourse? In Foucault's view, power and knowledge are inextricably linked, and power operates through development and construction of discourses. So there are two things. First, power and knowledge are linked, interconnected. Very often, people say that power and knowledge both were addressed by similar terms by Foucault. That means Foucault himself was not much differentiating between the notions of power and knowledge. To that extent, these are interrelated. However, power operates through the development and construction of discourses. That means when we try to understand how power is operating, then power is not operating the way we have been understanding power. That there are certain institutions where power is vested, and then those authorities basically make use of power. So sometime you can talk about the oppressing power kind of thing. No, not that way. Foucault says that power operates through the development and construction of discourses. So, those who can construct new discourses, those who can develop new discourses, and if those discourses establish their dominance, then power will automatically come. So, it is a different approach to understand that. But again, we have not understood the word discourse. So, discourse constitute ways of seeing and understanding the world. That means whatever is happening in this world, there are multiple ways of looking at it. So, there are different ways of looking at the various phenomena which are happening, and ways of seeing and understanding the world basically constitute discourse. If someone is looking at the things from a particular perspective, then that will make one discourse. And if others are looking at the same thing from a different perspective, then that may make another discourse. Now, I would like to give one example. Suppose something is happening, some political event is there, and we get to know about it from the media. Then maybe when we hear about it for the first time, whatever political event it could be, when we hear about it for the first time, then first time we get to know that, okay, such and such thing has happened. That is, we get a kind of information. But we do not have any view about that because we are just consuming that as an information. But later on, when we try to understand that particular thing at a length, then we may get to know about the views expressed by maybe certain political parties, or maybe certain media channels, or maybe certain other agencies. So when these different types of views are expressed, then those views very often create some kind of discourses. So related to that one particular phenomenon, there can be multiple discourses, and whichever discourse is basically becoming dominant, so the power basically will shift in that particular direction. So this is what basically I understand with the word discourse. Now Foucault says that discourses constitute the ways of seeing and understanding the world and are not just constraining but also productive. Now what is very important is this, that discourses are not just constraining but they also have productive functions. So it would not be fair to conclude that discourses are negative only. But discourses do have positive functions. Discourses do play productive role. That means whatever is happening, there are certain things which are productive also. There are certain things which are constraining also. Discourses may take either of the routes or several other routes. Medical discourses are guidelines as to how patients should understand and regulate their bodies. Now we come to medical discourses. So what do we understand by medical discourses? These are the guidelines as to how patients should understand and regulate their bodies as prescribed by doctors, medical practitioners, and they create new ways of thinking, new possibilities, and new opportunities. So whenever we get those guidelines about how to behave in a specific way or how to respond to certain things under certain situations or circumstances, when there is some kind of problems related to illness or sickness, then those things basically could be identified as medical discourses. And every system of medicine is having its own discourses. We have already talked about biomedicine and some of the alternative medicine, traditional medicine. So every medicine is having some kind of discourses. You might have heard the word cold food and hot food. I mean, the food which can create some kind of cold impact or the food which can create some kind of hot impact. So what is this? These are a kind of discourses, right? Hope you got it. Now, medicine of the species and medicine of social spaces. Now, this is a very important concept. Foucault is not only trying to understand the medical discourses or basically the behavior related to health at the individual level, but he's talking about basically the medical behavior which is prevailing at a larger level. And so, to capture the larger understanding, he talks about medicine in two different contexts. One, medicine of the species, and second, medicine of social spaces. You need to understand the word social space. We'll talk about it. The major contribution of Michel Foucault to medical sociology is his analysis of the social functions of the medical profession, including use of medical knowledge as a means of social control and regulation. Now, this is very important. Foucault says that one of the functions of medical profession is to control and regulate people. Now, he is talking about altogether a new phenomenon. That one of the functions of medicine is to control and regulate people. And his studies on madness, clinic, and sexuality are basically highlighting this particular approach or dimension. According to Foucault, power does not exist in doctors considered as figures of domination. Instead, it exists in a relationship between people. So, power is not something which is associated with certain people who are in certain authority. For that matter, a medical officer, because of having that authority, is not enjoying power. But power is vested, power is existing in the kind of relationship that people have, and because of the specific discourses which come into existence. So we have already talked about the medical discourses. So when medical professionals are interacting with people, then during this interaction, certain discourses do come into existence or certain discourses do become dominant. And through these discourses and interaction, basically power is exercised. Now, for making us to understand the differences between medicine of a species and medicine of social species, Foucault found two distinct trends emerging in the history of medical practice. One, medicine of the species, which refers to the classification, diagnosis, and treatment of disease. And second, medicine of social spaces, which is related to prevention of disease or often considered as public health also. Medicine of the species, I have highlighted the word species so that you can remember when we are talking about species, that means he is talking about the human body. Medicine of the species, which refers to the classification, diagnosis, and treatment of disease. It defined the human body as an object of study, subject to medical intervention and control. Again, two or three important things. First, talking about medicine of the species. Now, species refers to people. So, it's talking about medicine of the people or human body. Then it defines human body and it says that it is an object of study subject to medical intervention and control. So, when someone is basically going to a doctor, then the person is getting reduced to a human body, and the medical professional is supposed to make any kind of medical intervention. So, by making those medical intervention, the medical profession is actually controlling that human body, and that is medicine of the species. Then we talk about medicine of social species, which is related to prevention of disease. It made the public health subject to medical and civil regulation. When Foucault talks about medicine of social species, then he is talking about basically the preventive medicine or the public health system that we are often talking about, right? But what points he is making? He is saying that this public health or preventive health is actually used as a tool of civil regulation and then as a state control over public through public health. That means the government is making use of this notion of public health for regulating the public spaces, for regulating the public at large. Now, this is very unique kind of understanding, but Foucault is known for that. The surveillance of human sexuality by the state, church, and medicine subjected most intimate bodily activities to institutional discourse and monitoring. Again, multiple things are stated here. First, that there is an increasing surveillance of human sexuality, because Foucault talks about surveillance society or administered society. So, some kind of surveillance is basically going on. Now, who is doing that surveillance? Now, three agencies are identified: the state, then the church, that is the religious institutions, and then the third one is the medicine. Then, what do they basically make a surveillance of? They make a surveillance of the most intimate bodily activities. Thus, the bodies themselves came under the jurisdiction of experts on behalf of society. That means Foucault is talking about situations that when the intimate areas of life are basically not only getting regulated, but also somehow a kind of surveillance is taking place through these medical interventions, whether that is existing in the form of medicine of the species or existing in the form of medicine of social spaces. Then we talk about another important concept, that is medical gaze. Foucault saw medicalization not as the simple exercise of personal power by profession intent on extending its boundaries, but as a historical process deriving from the power of clinical knowledge and the redefinition of medicine to include psychological, economic, and social health. Now, again, two, three things basically mentioned over here. One important thing: redefinition of medicine to include psychological, economic, and social health. We have been talking about the social factors, the social determinants, the psychological determinants, the environmental determinants. But what is happening is this, that through the process of medicalization, actually the system of medicine or medical profession or medicine as an institution is absorbing all the other issues which were primarily highlighted in those decades. This is basically making the institution of medicine even more powerful. And what is interesting is this, that for Foucault, this is a historical process. So this is happening because of the developments taking place in the history as such. Let me repeat it. so that you can understand. Foucault saw medicalization not as the simple exercise of personal power by profession. We have explained this point earlier also, that it's not about power remaining concentrated in certain people or certain authority intent on extending its boundary, but as a historical process deriving from the power of clinical knowledge. Now, where from the power is coming actually? The power is coming from the clinical knowledge, and that is why Foucault says knowledge is power. So you might have heard the word knowledge is power, and here he is talking about it, that because of the clinical knowledge and because of the redefinition given to health and medicine, that the power is coming. Foucault argued that dominance of professional power of doctors led to their convergence around the medical gaze, through which the sick are represented as objects for surveillance and technical intervention. This is again a very different kind of situation. Foucault developed the concept of the medical gaze, describing how doctors fit a patient's story into a biomedical paradigm, filtering out what is deemed as irrelevant material. So, what is stated here? That medical gaze is a kind of situation in which the doctors take the story, the narrative from the patient, but from that larger narrative, they filter the relevant information and often ignore certain information so that the story could get fitted in a biomedical paradigm. This is what is identified as or defined as medical gaze. Now we will look to the other statement. Foucault argued that the dominance of professional power of doctors led to their convergence around the medical gaze. So when doctors are having some kind of professional power, now this power is basically related to redefining the things and clinical knowledge. So because of that clinical knowledge and the capacity to redefine, they are having a kind of professional power. And because of that professional power, basically a convergence around the medical gaze is happening, through which sick people are represented as object for surveillance and technical intervention. So the sick are already sick, but the problem here is this, that they are considered as object for surveillance, and not only that, but also for technical intervention. So the way medical technology is basically getting intermingled with the kind of health system we all are having, that is suggesting that kind of thing. Now we will talk about three phases of biopolitics. Nicholas Rose has expanded the Foucauldian perspective on biopolitics and offers three phases of biopolitics to understand new forms of medical culture and social control. So, used the term biopolitics to understand the medical culture and its impact on social control. So, making use of the term biopolitics to understand the medical culture and social control. Now, what are these three forms? One, risk politics. It characterizes the first half of the 20th century when the focus was on prevention of major public health problems. So, defined well that the focus was on prevention of major public health problem, right? And the time period is also there, the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. We are aware that there were certain pandemics in Europe as well as other parts of the world. So that is related to that. Molecular politics is a reorganization of the medical gaze at the molecular level. Now we have already understood medical gaze, and that is why we try to understand medical gaze. Now what is stated that there is a reorganization of medical gaze at the molecular level. This politics is represented by, for example, biological psychiatry, a discipline that looks at the neurotransmitters of the brain to identify chemical imbalances that are seen as the causes of mental pathogens. So basically what is stated that very often we have the psychological conditions, and sometimes medical specialization like psychiatry is used, and this psychiatry is basically trying to look at the things at a biological level, at a molecular level, by talking about some kind of chemical imbalances happening at the level of the pathologies. So this is a different kind of understanding about the reorganization of the medical gaze. Then at third level talks about current biopolitics and says that this has taken the character of ethopolitics. Now, what is this ethopolitics? It demands an optimization of one's corporeality to embrace an enlarged will to health, and concerns itself with the self techniques by which human beings should judge themselves and act upon themselves to make themselves better than they are. So, corporeality is basically related to the body or the physique. So, optimization of one's corporeality, that means optimization of one's body, one's physical capacity, right? So, this ethopolitics demands an optimization of one's physical capacities, corporeality. Why? To embrace an enlarged will, right, to health. That means for seeking good health, and concerns itself with the self techniques by which human beings should judge themselves. So, also talking about some kind of engagement with the self techniques which human beings should judge themselves and act upon themselves to make themselves better than they are. That means the focus is on making some kind of self improvement, and so that the optimization of the physical capacity should take place. This is the core argument. It is argued that this view, this new regime, blurs the boundaries between expert knowledge and the individual's will to self regulation. So, if the individuals have this optimum level of understanding, that means their power or their capacity is basically getting enhanced. So, that way it blurs the boundaries between expert knowledge and the individual's will to self regulation. In this kind of society, individuals are still dependent on experts who provide the technology for rational management of the self. However, on the one situation, there is a kind of understanding like ethopolitics, and on the other hand, we are having a situation where people are dependent on experts who provide the technology for rational management of the self. So these are the three phases of biopolitics, and that way we can say that Foucault talked about multiple concepts, and if we try to understand those concepts, then we get to know about his understanding of certain things and his explanation of certain things which are happening in the contemporary societies. However, Foucault's perspective is not free from criticism. So, Foucault has presented a complex relationship among medicine, power, and discourses. And although we try to simplify, but we to what extent we were successful, that I don't know. But those are actually complex, and it will not be possible to talk about all those concepts in one or two lecture, right? Then, one feature of Foucauldian writing on medicine that has been the subject of quite some criticism is their general focus on analyzing the discourses evident in official text. So, Foucault talks about discourses, but a criticism is made that Foucault talks about the discourses which are evident in the official texts, and they neglect the ways that the medical practitioners and lay people themselves practice. So, what is practiced is not to that extent taken care of, and what is basically prescribed in the official text is basically taken care of. So, that way, the understanding about the discourse is also uh, tilted towards the official texts and not towards the practices and the experiences at the larger level. That is a very serious criticism. Then Foucault is criticized for becoming deterministic also. Deterministic means who is focusing a lot or primarily on one determinant. So that is deterministic. Foucault is criticized for becoming deterministic as discourses are represented as subjugating human agency. So if the discourses are so important, then where do the humans are basically existing? Because if we try to understand Foucauldian uh, perspective, then we get to know that the discourses are more important than the human agency. So that way it is becoming deterministic, and when any thinker is identified as deterministic, then that basically undermines his contribution. So these are some of the criticism. However, our purpose of including these views in this lecture was this, that what kind of criticism biomedicine or biomedical perspective or the system of medicine have been witnessing, and how those criticism have actually helped biomedicine to grow further and to become more inclusive. And medicalization as a process primarily talks about that the criticism is there, because of that criticism some kind of improvement is there, and then the system is becoming more inclusive. So thank you very much for being with me in this very important lecture. Here is the think about this problem: how will you explain the concept of biopolitics? We have tried to make you understand here. You can read some of the text also and then think over this. And then activity question: can you identify some of the important medical discourses prevailing in your society or community? So in every society or community there are medical discourses. We have tried to make you understand the concept of medical discourse. So try to identify some of the medical discourses. That will help you in further strengthening your thought on this concept. So thank you very much. Take care. We will meet in the next lecture.